Jacksonville, a child was born who couldn't sit still. 86 years later with no regret. You know that man can't sit still yet. The Great Depression couldn't get him down. He worked for his dad's store in town, collecting money in small amounts for poor whites and blacks in their furniture accounts. Stetson Kennedy wants us all to be free. Stetson Kennedy wants us all to be free. As he'd collect, he'd talk to folks. He'd hear legends, tales, songs, and jokes. Now this fine treasure he'd record and write. He was colorblind, didn't see black and white. Writer's project for the WPA. Zora Neale Hurston, he earned his pay. Crackers and blacks, they talk for hours. It was a barefoot history, this land of flowers.
From WBRN Radio in Boston and on the Boston Red Network, the week that was on the 16th of September 2017. Reminding people that later today from Landover, Maryland, a memorial service for Dick Gregory. We'll, of course, cover that memorial service and the events surrounding the late Dick Gregory. May he rest in peace. Today, we look at Karl Rove, his latest pronouncement, where the Republicans are or not in Congress. The latest demonstrations in reaction to a murder in St. Louis. We'll start off with the St. Louis story, and then we'll go back to Washington and tie it up with Uncle Karl Rove. In the sports section, we'll talk about Jay-Z and his latest song, the Brooklyn Rapper, performed in New York. And the song was dedicated to Colin Kaepernick and also to the late Dick Gregory. It's called The Story of O.J. Simpson. It is not as they say, an American rags to riches Horatio Alger story. It's a story of an African man in America. And I invite you to check out the story of O.J. It's on the web, his latest song from Jay-Z. But let's first go to St. Louis and start the story off with the presiding judge. His name was Tim Wilson. He will be retiring in December. He was appointed by one John Ashcroft. One does not need to know more than that, how he was set up. There's various machinations about where he was. This was a first-degree murder trial of Jason Stockley, a former St. Louis cop that was charged with murder in the case of Lamar Smith that was in December 20th of 2011. Very old case. It had been settled civilly and a number of charges brought forth. Now, this is from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and whether or not his collection, this is the judge in the case of Three Stooges episodes on tape, and the Christmas Story doesn't really matter. And what else has he got going? Allows his court reporter's dog to visit a pet cat. Well, if he's an eccentric or not an eccentric really doesn't matter there. He had served on the Second Judicial Circuit for 28, almost 30 years after being, of course, appointed by Ashcroft. Wilson, prior to that, was a federal prosecutor. He's one of these judges, more and more of them around, that had been prosecutors and persecutors at one time. No doubt he's one of those types, and as we get into the story, you'll understand his from his perspective. One of the statements he made in his opinion is that a drug dealer basically always has a gun. Now, this is contention here. Let's start out the story that resulted in this is from Stockley himself. Almost 6 years, the judge confirmed, and this story is by Christine Byers of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. It was filed 5 hours ago, I suppose, on the 16th of September, I believe. Anyway, just looking at the line here. After almost 6 years, the judge confirmed Friday what Jason Stockley always believed. He was not guilty of murder. No doubt he did. It feels like a burden had been lifted, but the burden of having killed someone never really lifts. That's what he said in an interview. It was on Friday. My main concern now is for first responders and people just trying to do their work. And the protesters, I don't want anybody to get hurt. Well, people did get hurt. This Stockley character now lives in Houston. He's works for an oil company, which you can figure that. The shooting there in 11, and Chase was involved there also in this. The 24-year-old Lamar Smith. It was around, I guess, a Christmas present, we could say. Protests erupted in St. Louis. The chase after Stockley and his partner, Brian Bacilli, tried to arrest Smith for a suspicious drug deal at a Church's Chicken. Yeah, I remember that one. Nonetheless, I feel for and understand what the family is going through. That's what Stockley supposedly said. They all say this, and that's what the judge did in the case. He said nothing that Wilson found on the 15 seconds between the time Stockley left his police car and then unholstered his weapon and fired at Smith as a proof that he did not execute him. Tears from the former police officer's eyes, I imagine so. Asked why he agreed to be interviewed. Well, anyway, he said, because I did nothing wrong. He assumes that. Very self-righteous person. Stockley had been a police officer for 5 years. He had a military career. He couldn't have much of a military career because a number of years. He was a graduate of the military academy at West Point. That's kind of interesting. Usually West Pointers stay in the military. He said he chose police work after his tour of duty in Iraq. Now, it doesn't say how many tours of duty he had, but nonetheless, he armed himself with an unauthorized AK-47 pistol with 100 rounds. That kind of tells you what this bird was doing to begin with. I use it as a deterrent. I believe it's better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. At the trial that was in August, the prosecutors alleged that Stockley told his partner that he was going to kill Smith while they were pursuing him, then planted a gun. This is a normal procedure that happens. The planting of guns. He's heard on the video saying, "I'm going to kill this expletive." You can imagine what. Don't you know it? The prosecutor said. Stockley said he didn't remember making a statement of what he said before or after. I guess he didn't. In a 30-page ruling, old Wilson, the 70-year-old Ashcroft appointee, said the statements made to his partner lacked content because everything said before and immediately after was inaudible in his car cam video. Shockley's decision to enter the vehicle after the shooting was another point the prosecutor made, criticizing it makes no sense for an officer involved in shooting to handle evidence. That's right. That's called chain of custody. Evidently, he broke it right away. It suggested that was when he planted the gun. Shockley said that he knew what the gun looked like. How did he know what the gun looked like? And he wanted to find it as quickly as possible if Smith had thrown it out the window. The judge said there was no evidence proving the gun had been planted. It was reasonable for Shockley to believe Smith was reaching for a gun. And that was the same thing in many cases. Most recently, Philando Castile was reaching for a gun. Shockley said the only thing he wished he have done differently the day of the shooting was take the day off. Now, that's a very cynical comment there. So, in other words, he shot the man, he got away with it, and that was the end of it. I don't know how changing any number of my actions that day would have changed the outcome. He continued. The decision to use force could be the most important decision you ever make because it could be your last. Multiple investigations. Shockley resigned from the police force in 2013 after a 30-day suspension for carrying that AK-47 pistol on duty. He now has this management position in Texas. He claimed he wanted to change careers. He lied. Internal investigation, the FBI investigation the shooting, but no charges were issued. That is pretty normal what goes on. Then the circuit attorney, Jennifer Joyce, charged Shockley with first-degree murder. That was in May of 2016. Stockley noted 3 weeks earlier demonstrations at Joyce's house over her decision not to prosecute an officer in a different way. Well, anyway, it doesn't matter. And his scenario of what happened to him, he said that he may have prompted the action in his case. In other words, he's a blamer, claimed that Jennifer Joyce made an emotional decision, from personal and political reasons, not a legal one. How does he know? He's not a prosecutor nor a lawyer. Stockley was at home in Houston when police arrived to arrest him. He said he was watching a movie with his wife when the power suddenly went out. He went out to check the breakers and noticed only his house was without power. He turned around to find some Houston cops with guns drawn. He wondered whether there was a mistake. Then he said he saw 2 St. Louis police officers. That was when I realized they were there for me and it wasn't just a power outage. I couldn't believe it. Stockley has remained in the area since then as a condition of his bail, in which he couldn't leave town. Spent his time consumed in the evidence of his case. I feel a sense of relief, but no one lied on the stand. But the relief goes only so far. He said he feared for his life during the hour-long interview when someone knocked at his door. He pulled a gun that he kept nearby. My life has been turned into turmoil for some time, and I've been in a holding pattern, haven't been able to be with my family. I've tried my best to not let this dictate my life. Well, Mr. Smith doesn't have a life anymore, and that's the background to Stockley's situation. Now we'll go to the headline here in the Dispatch. Officers injured, 9 of them in downtown St. Louis. Well, the situation was most of these so-called injuries, as it usually is, were injuries that were not life-threatening and didn't involve even going to a medical center. So a lot of times we see these types of things going where they don't go to a medical center. And let me just get this. We were looking at the not guilty plea here. And I suppose, wait a minute here. But nonetheless, there were a number of demonstrations there. They were all over the place. They even ended up at the mayor's house. And the mayor was inside. The police evidently intervened, so there was not a problem there. And let's get the story here. This is on the East End. 1,000 protesters were around there, and the mayor, Linda, I guess that's pronounced Newsom, in the central West End. That was late on Friday. Red paint and 2 windows were broken. No incidents occurred at the house. Total of 9 police officers were injured. They claimed, but I believe 2 officers were injured by bricks thrown, and they were taken to hospital with one described as serious. The third was hurt, but declined treatment. That's usually the case. So the demonstration was peaceful until nightfall. That's usually the case with demonstrations. But what triggered the activity? Usually these types of activities are triggered by citizens when they have no other recourse. And that, of course, happened in Ferguson and in many other places. St. Louis has a history of these types of activities. It's nothing new there to the city of St. Louis. They have been in a racial divide there forever. St. Louis at one time the gateway to the west, and then all of a sudden they dropped from the gateway to the west. They were 3rd or 4th largest city, and they just went into the abyss and have not been seen since. This is a typical situation. Orders to dispense were given numerous times. They claim bricks were thrown. This is a usual scenario. You get the police tweeted using the term agitators because of violence towards and destruction of property. I don't know how much destruction of property was there. They haven't really said. Central Library windows were shuttered, and Culpepper's Grill and so forth there shattered. Excuse me. So some windows were broken out in a number of places. The public library. And demonstrators were pepper sprayed. I won't go into details of St. Louis in various areas, but downtown, nothing serious. And from what we see here, no fires were set. 4 these officers were injured downtown, sustained minor injuries. And this is usually what happens. So we have 5 there. More than a dozen protesters were arrested, not very many there. But it was the... From this article, you can see, and we posted it up on Facebook and on the Twitter feed. You can see right away what happened there and how the police were increasingly militarized. And incidentally, DJ Trump has brought back the militarization of police. And this is from McLeod Ahmed. After being amazed, we stood our ground so the bus would move. This is a bus loaded with any coppers. And this is usually how it all starts out. The goal is to resist the power to people. That is from Renita Lumpkin Green. She's pastor of the pastor of the St. James African Methodist Episcopal Church. We tried to find a way to... wait a minute, hold it. Oh, this is somebody else. We won't even get into that. A way to live together, well, that won't happen. We are sad and frustrated, and quite frankly, we are pissed off. That is from Alderman John Collins Muhammad. Until black people in this city get justice, until we get a seat at the table, there will be no peace in this city. And evidently that is the situation. They have been having this problem for many years. A group of protesters led by a veteran activist, Zika, started at Market Street in the morning, walking south on Tucker, west on Clark, trying to get to a ramp westbound I-40. It's Interstate 64 highway, I-40, Interstate 64. About 30 police officers with bikes blocked their access. Many protesters starting heading from all the modal transportation hub there. So in other words, this was basically all over the city, down around the convention center. Press conference with activists at the scene of Lamar Smith's murder. So this is basically the story of St. Louis. We'll leave the story of St. Louis and head to Washington. And the Post, this is from the Washington Post, the story of the GOP on the Hill. Not a very good story, the ebbs and flows of their influence. Well, the GOP came into this with an election of DJ Trump. They control both the House and the Senate. But the problem is, ideologically, within their particular vein of conservative ideology, there's a little bit of difference there. The so-called Freedom Republican-type caucus, a study group, various other characters believing in philosophies that some that believe in fiscal conservatism, that the deficit should be cut, but at the same time, government spending should be cut to match taxes. Now, little Paulie Ryan, the Speaker, has to admit that the Republic, at least his Republican plan of tax cuts, will put a hole further into deficit. So, in other words, when you cut taxes, you have to immediately cut spending, and cutting spending is not easy. Because if you cut spending in one program, it affects another program. A good example of this is what happened what is happening, I should say, in Florida right now. The cleanup there from Irma is a very, very large operation. And what happened in Houston, they're trying to get the trash moved away. And the municipal trash, obviously, system is not working there. It had been cut back, has to be expanded realistically. Some residents are even talking about using a private haulers to move it away. And according to the mayor, I think it said $200 million is needed just for the cleanup campaign, period. And back to this article here, some are privately fuming. These are the Republicans there, senators who were top targets. They're talking about Heidi Heitkamp and Mr. Meacham in West Virginia were being praised by DJ Trump. Well, these are moderate, what we call conservative Democrats, so they're nothing new. It is not so much about power as their ability to influence the president. That's from Michael Steele, if you remember him. He used to be chair of the Republican Party. Trump, he said, is recognizing I don't have to play with you, Paul and Mitch. I can play with Nancy and Chuck. We did an episode on Nancy and Chuck. That's Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi of California. The Paul and Mitch, as Paul Ryan and Old Man McConnell, were not invited to the meeting, so he left them at home. And it was merely a deal to make a deal. That's John Cornyn. He's from Texas, and a top deputy to Old Man McConnell. First off, there's no agreement, he said, but the problem is here, there is no agreement, but the public perception. It came out that a deal was made, and Trump went on Twitter as well, not yet. Then he came back and said basically it was. So we'll stay tuned for that, but the problem here is that he will not get a deal. The president's sudden desire to negotiate also struck a deal last week to raise the deficit ceiling. That is in effect till December, and other things to come. Now, the first deal we talked about was on DECA, the Dreamers, and how to do that, and also to deal with security of the wall, Trump's precious wall. So what type of wall he gets is very difficult to say at this point in time. But nonetheless, we'll see. Okay, let's move on. Oh, the Florida nursing home, we don't want to forget about it, where the 8 elderly people, I believe it was 8, died. The problem there was the cooling system failed. They had a special number to call the governor. They called the number evidently 3 times, and it was not answered as it should have been. They called a private number. It's according to Natasha Anderson. That was from Rick Scott. In an emergency backup plan before the storm, this number was given out. It was not immediately returned. By Wednesday, 8 residents were dead. Their deaths are being investigated as criminal homicide. The nursing home, of course, has been closed. The account of the nursing home executives provided to the Post offer new details of deteriorating condition inside the facility. But it also contradicts law enforcement and state officials on key points, including how aggressive the nursing home had sought assistance precisely when the staff called 911 as a patient went into a cardiac arrest. So the health department in Florida said in no time did the nursing home report that conditions had become dangerous and that health and safety of their patients were at risk. This is shocking that these trained medical professionals put patients' lives in needless jeopardy. The rehabilitation says Hollywood Hills, not an idea, we'd have to ask H about that, is responsible for health and safety of their patients. And the communication director emailed that every call made to the governor from a facility manager is referred, and this is where the blame game goes on. The Agency for Healthcare Administration and the Florida Department of Health quickly returned. Toops gave a follow-up to the email asking if the governor's office had a record of the 3 calls from the nursing home. Did not respond. Evidently they did. The tragedy in Hollywood Hills shows with billions of dollars and countless hours spent preparing for the next eventual hurricane, a lifetime for one of the nation's largest concentrations of elderly disabled remains tenuous in the aftermath of Irma. The survival residents at the home rested not just on the state's $3 million smart grid intended to limit power outages and target repairs efforts, and our limits of critical infrastructure for restoring power is a top priority. Survivors depended on phone tag between literally nursing home administrators and state officials and the utilities. Several executives at a limited liability corporation that controls the nursing home declined to comment. The principal owner is a Florida resident, Jack Michon. But the nursing home made Anderson available for an hour-long interview, as well as company officials who spoke on condition of anonymity under a ground rule set by Hollywood Hills. The offices provide internal time. None of attempts to reach state officials, nurses, doctors, administrative staff. Everyone is doing all they could, and they obviously would put this out there. And the nursing home and adjoining psychiatric facility connected to a power grid by 2 lines. The officials said one line provides electricity, including lights, oxygen machines, etc. The other one is a central air conditioning system. When the air warm became pouring out of vents, the executive contacted Florida Power and Light within 45 minutes, saying the line approaching the facility from the north appeared to have been down. Anderson said the nursing home heard from the utility Monday that it would be coming that day. It never did. The nursing home provided ticket numbers for service requests to the power company. The power company expressed our deficits simply anyway. Hollywood Hills had, in the days before the storm, obtained 8 spot chillers that could be run using generators. Each 2 arm-like funnels that direct cool air. Exhaust vents from each machine. Warm air was routed upwards and dropped to the cellar. They had some portable fans. Spent $900 to put one in each residence room. These portable fans didn't cost very much money then. At 5 p.m., more than 25 hours after the air conditioning stopped working, with forecasts for high temperatures ahead, Anderson said she called the governor's mobile phone, left a message that 162 patients, elderly, some on oxygen, were in need of air conditioning. Between then and 10 p.m. Monday, Anderson said she received 2 return calls from the state saying they were working on it. Typical. So this is a story there. I told Florida Power and Light the generators were going to give up soon. And as it happened, I told my husband's people were going to die in there. And it happened, she said. Well, no doubt about it. When you have temps in the 80s, as it is in Florida with elderly people, you have a problem, and a very big problem, period, there. Across the street, Memorial Regional Medical Center, one senior nurse walked over to there, and she made a call. These patients need to be evacuated immediately. The second floor was extremely hot, and there was no reason patients that age with chronic health issues should be in a facility without air conditioning. The hospital activated what it called mass casualty event. Hospital staff rushed to the nursing facility looking for patients and getting them out as soon as possible. And they went literally room to room to evacuate the place. The sickest patients were routed to the emergency room across the street with on stretchers with being treated with dehydration, etc. So evidently they did save some lives. The temperature during the day outside in the mid-90s. In a statement later, Scott called the situation unfashionable and vowed that the state would hold accountable anyone not acting in the best interest of their patients. So they are blaming the nursing facility is what you're getting here. We did the police story. Let's check on our time here as we move along. In pretty good shape. We'll go and find Uncle Carl Rowe before we forget him. Where did he go? Hiding from us somewhere here. Nonetheless, 30 Republicans hold up tax reform. He's writing in the Wall Street Journal on the 14th of September. No matter how persuasive DJ Trump is, it's unlikely he can round up enough Democrats to get 60 votes in the Senate for tax reform. That means Republicans would need to use the reconciliation process, which avoids the filibuster to pass their plan with 51 votes. But first, the House and Senate must pass a budget resolution, and soon. The budget resolution sets spending levels, authorizes congressional committees to prepare bills fulfilling the blueprint with the reconciliation plan in mind this year. The resolution would set the size of a tax reform, then instruct the House Ways and Means and Senate Finance Committee to flush out the provisions. Granting an agreement on the budget resolution is always tough. Gaining no more than a handful of lawmakers from the opposite party ever vote for a majority resolution. It helps that the Republicans control both houses, but Republicans must still resolve its internal philosophical disagreements, which we said earlier. House Republicans tend to insist on a resolution that balance the budget within 10 years. This means a resolution but pledges to slow substantially the growth of entitlement programs. This has been around forever. Such promises are rarely fulfilled. Uncle Carl is correct about this, but putting them on a budget blueprint fuels Democrat ads claiming Republicans would throw grandmother off the cliff. In fact, they would deprive poor children of free lunches. Knowing this, Senate Republicans tend to want a resolution that reaches a balance after 10 years. Another tension is between the defense hawks who increase defense spending and the deficit hawks who want all spending restraint cut. These are nerdy but important technical arguments stating how the resolution spending baseline is calculated, beginning with a baseline of current law. You hear that from the OCB briefings, meaning assuming that a tax break currently authorized for only 1 year or two will actually expire instead of being reauthorized by Congress. But Congress renews such tax breaks annually and probably will do so through the next decade, 10 years. To account for this, many in the GOP want to calculate the baseline on the current policy. It sounds technical, but it's quickly become political. Democrats demand current law because a higher baseline would make a tax reform appear to raise the deficit more than it actually does. On the other hand, a lower baseline would give tax reform more wiggle room. One Republican tax expert tells me current policy would provide on paper $450 billion that would be used to lower rates and make a tax code simple and fair. Dynamic scoring is another geeky fight. A tax reform that generates economic growth will offset some government revenue loss from cutting the rates. Republicans want their bill elevated with dramatic scoring evaluated because it takes this effort into account and makes reform more attractive. Democrats opposed it for the same reason. Still, given the time and the leadership both on Capitol Hill and from the White House, Republicans could cobble together a budget resolution setting up a strong tax reform which would juice the economy and deem the Republican and redeem the GOP in the midterm election. Wishful thinking there on the part of Uncle Karl Rove. They will not get to 60 votes. They'll try to get 51 votes, but the 51 votes is very tenuous in of that to pass their so-called tax reform. It will depend on where DJ Trump stands in the argument. A story here from the public news service while we are here out of Kansas City. It was an easy decision to make, and Corey Gallagher did not have much time to make it. The principal of Kansas City Academy, a private college preparatory school, received a call from the federal Denny DeVos at 4 p.m. on Friday, asking if the academy would play host to the controversial person. DeVos will in fact be in Kansas City Academy later this morning, Gallagher said, and why the board presidents and I really turn to our education philosophy for guidance, and our philosophy readily encourages us to be inclusive and to celebrate diversity, he explained, and that doesn't just mean demographics diversity, but also diversity of thought and what a cop-out, and worldview and life experience. DeVos has long been known for promoting charter schools and school vouchers, and recently made headlines saying she would consider current enforcement of Title IX of policies that emphasize gender equality. Gallagher said he met with organizers of potential protests outside of the academy, who agreed to make it clear they are not protesting the school, but instead of Betty DeVos itself. Educators tend to be liberal in their orientation, So there's a lot of concern that consenting to this would also be interpreted as consenting to her policies or the DJ Trump policies in general. He added, Gallagher said that in the wake of his decision to host Davos, some staff members voiced disapproval. Gallagher has encouraged the staff to view the visit as an opportunity to showcase their school, but not in the way in which he perhaps would want to. Anyway, to sport, we earlier talked about Jay-Z and his concert, which he dedicated to Colin Kopech, and the All-American hero O.J. Simpson, who will be returning to Florida. We assume the residents of Florida will be happy to see O.J. They've had various events there. Irma has appeared there. Rush Limbaugh fled the place, and now O.J. will arrive. Nonetheless, on Friday night, the White Sox were in the Motor City. Sox is 17-7 over the Tigers. The Athletics were in Fenway Park. Red Sox 6-2. The Reds were in St. Louis. Cards 5-2 there. The Rockies were at the D-backs and were shut out by the D-backs 7-zip. The Orioles were in New York. Yankees 13-5. Atlanta was in Washington. Nationals 5-2. They move on. The Marlins were in Philadelphia and were shut out by the Phillies 10-zip. And in 10, the Royals were in Cleveland. Cleveland pulled that one out 3-2. Cleveland had 12 hits, no errors, and the Royals 9 hits and no errors there. The Mariners were in Texas, winning the game 10-4. The Mets were in Wrigley. They were in Wrigley Field. Wait a minute, make sure we got the right date here. Oops. Knew something was wrong here. That was Thursday's scores. Now, the Cardinals were in Wrigley Field. Cubs win at 8-2. The Dodgers were in Washington. Dodgers 7-0 over the Nationals. The Orioles were in New York. Yankees 8-2. The Athletics were in Philly, and this time around the Athletics went at 4-zip over the Phillies. And the Royals were in Cleveland. Royals 4-3 in that contest. The Royals had 11 hits, no errors, and Cleveland 6 hits and 1 error. The White Sox were in the Motor City. Tiger 3-2. The Pirates were at the Reds. Reds 4-2 there, and in 15 in Florida, the Red Sox 13-5 over the Rays. The Sox had 21 hits and 1 error, and the Rays 13 hits and 3 errors. You don't win a game doing that many errors. And the Mets were in Atlanta. Atlanta 5-2 over the Mets. Toronto was in the Twin Cities. Blue Jays 4-3. The Blue Jays had 8 hits, no errors, and the Twins 7 hits and no errors there. The Mariners were at the Astros in Houston. Houston goes about its winning ways of 5-2 Astros over the Mariners. The Brewers were in Florida. Brewers 10-2. The Brewers have won a lot of games lately. That race is getting close. Padres and Rockies. Rockies 6-1 over the Padres. And the Rangers and Angels in California. Rangers 7-6. And finally, the D-backs and Giants in San Francisco. The D-backs pull that one out 3-2. That's the race for second place going along. Let's quickly get the standings here. The Sox are on top. The Yankees are coming up from behind. They're 3 games out. That's in the American League East. In the American League Central, Cleveland has clinched. Naturally, they would. And let me see, where are the Twins in this race? 13.5 games back. The Royals are 17.5 games back. In the American League West, Houston is on top. The Angels are 14 games back. The Mariners are 15.5 games back. In the National League East, the Nationals have clinched their division, and the Marlins are 21 games back. Oh well. In the Central, the Cubs are on top. Milwaukee is coming up very fast, 3 games back, and the Cards are 4 games back. In the National League West, the Dodgers have clinched a playoff berth, no doubt about that, and the Arizona is 9.5 games back. Had to get what the symbols were about here. The Nationals, they won their division. Has anyone else got a Z? Cleveland is got a playoff berth. And that is the standings. And that is what we have here. And what else do we have? Well, in Miami, they are cleaning up the place quite literally. And I think we talked about this before. They're restoring power. They'll be back on Tuesday. A long time to wait on power. I remember losing power a few years ago, and it was not jolly. And then nonetheless, on Tuesday, we'll get that back in South Dade County. This will do it for us. We'll see you as Boston Red on the Monday Morning Quarterback. On a Monday morning, we'll be talking about the talk shows and about sport. And we'll try to talk a little bit more about sport. We'll get into college football. We didn't get that this time around. Nonetheless, have a good weekend, everyone. We'll see you on a Monday morning. Incidentally, the economics program Numbers Man will air this weekend, and perhaps another open source report. You can check all of those out at WBRN Network, BostonRed.org.